Saffery Champness have become well-known experts on the thorny issues of TOMS and VAT in the travel industry. David, it is a thorny issue, it is a very complex issue for a simpleton like myself. What's the big issue?
Well, the big issue is that the current rules are, as you've just said, very complicated, very difficult to understand, and they're different everywhere. It's supposed to be a harmonised scheme. It is supposed to operate in every single member state. There is a common piece of EU legislation which sets out what everybody is supposed to do. The problem really is that the legislation is unclear. So it gives scope for every single member state to approach the scheme in a different way. So it makes it extremely difficult for businesses, particularly those which are operating in more than one country, to actually understand properly what their obligations are.
Again, going back to simpleton terms, TOMS is a tour operator margin system. This is my understanding, it's a system where people can determine how much or if any VAT they pay when selling services. Is that correct?
It is, yes, tour operators margin scheme. It's 30 years old. It was brought in because there was a recognition that the VAT system would be extremely onerous for holiday companies without it. So the basic rule is that a holiday is subject to VAT where it takes place. So if you were a tour operator selling holidays enjoyed in, let's say, 20 different countries, without TOMS you'd be liable to register in all 20. So you'd have 20 different sets of rules to comply with, 20 tax returns each period to complete, and clearly it would be very difficult. So TOMS exists as a way of overcoming that, and it works by taxing the gross margin achieved by the tour operator in just one country, and that's the country where the tour operator is conducting his business. That's all. That's the theory of it, if you like, and that's all fine. In practice, of course, it becomes extremely difficult, and you get a lot of distortions of competition, perhaps between those businesses that do fall within the TOMS and those who, for whatever reason, fall outside. So one example we were talking about in the ATOA session was online intermediaries selling flights. Now, in many circumstances, perhaps not so much in the UK, but certainly elsewhere, an online intermediary selling a flight will have to pay VAT at whatever rate his own member state considers appropriate. Whereas, of course, an airline selling the same flight typically wouldn't pay any VAT. So it's an obvious example of a distortion between two businesses effectively selling the same product. So using that example, what we're saying really within ATOA is that distortion shouldn't exist. 15 years or so ago, holidays were sold by a tour operator fell into TOMS, would probably also fall within the Package Travel Directive. VAT would be paid, and there was relatively little debate about whether TOMS was applicable in those circumstances. As the industry has changed, so the issues which need to be considered have changed, and certainly bed banks and other online intermediaries selling perhaps a single product will often sell that product as an agent, and there's an argument that somebody selling as an agent is not required to use the TOMS. So there is a big debate ongoing as to whether that is actually correct. So it has changed everything enormously, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a single product. If you are an online retailer of travel products selling 2, 3, even 4 services online to make up a person's holiday, the same issue arises. Do you put it into TOMS or does it stay outside TOMS? So that's a very complicated area. Another issue in that respect is again coming back to the distortion of competition point, because of course because the rules are different, it makes it perhaps better to operate in one member state over another. Certain member states have derogations or permissions granted by the European Commission to operate in a way that is, in many cases, very different to the norm. So a number of member states have derogations to simply exempt tour operators. So whereas a tour operator based in the UK will certainly pay VAT, and it would be the same in most countries. In Denmark, for example, a tour operator based there quite legitimately pays nothing. So again, it's part of the European Commission's desire to get rid of those differences, but of course in practice it's extremely difficult.